what we should take away most of all, besides admiring his courage and fearlessness and his Christian faith, he was an inveterate practitioner, an incorrigible practitioner of reasoned discourse. Now you'd say, well, that's
Right.
great.
Right.
It sounds philosophical, and we're sort of philosophical at JWI. But there's something much more profound, at least I'm trying to say something much more profound. It actually is like coming into the cave with a lantern or a searchlight, because what Charlie Kirk is suggesting, he's indicating, what he's witnessing to is the possibility of a way out of the abyss. That is to say, renewing or instilling in young people the sense, you know what, there's actually if you take seriously thinking and listening and giving reasons, there actually is a payoff. You may actually discover what's true, what's real. If you want authenticity, then try to figure out what's real.
Welcome back to Natural Law Moment for an episode that is being recorded in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And we are doing so a little under 2 weeks after his assassination, with the two co-directors of the James Wilson Institute, Hadley, Arkes, and Gerry Bradley, having digested not only the immediate aftermath of the assassination, but also the wake, a memorial service that was held in Glendale, Arizona this past Sunday. But before we get to the unspeakable tragedy and the reactions to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we'd actually like to start with another item that's in the news, the major gathering at the United Nations in New York City this week. And so, Hadley, what do you take as one of the most notable signs that the United Nations is perhaps running on fumes?
Well, I would say something about Trump's speech to the UN for rather different reasons. It's a remarkable speech. It was the first time in memory that a president has gone to the UN and called into question the very rationale for the UN. We could point to its failures in feeding Hamas, in getting in the way of peace in many places. But what I thought would be useful to take a natural law moment on this occasion, is to point out where he decorously held back from challenging the root premises of the UN, the fact that membership in the United Nations depends not on the moral character of the regime, but on the positivist test of who is it who controls the territory. There was that notable instance with the Gipper with Ronald Reagan years ago, when he was asked by reporters to why he could support the Contras in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the legitimate government of Nicaragua. And Reagan said, well, it's true that the Contras are trying to take power at the point of a gun, but the current government in Nicaragua exists at the point of a gun. So I don't quite see what the difference is between the Contras and what you are pleased to call the legitimate government of Nicaragua. Now, the Gipper didn't know the bibliography there. He read widely, but he wasn't drawing on Vattel or Barlamaqui against Pufendorf, but he had a moral sense of these things. And that's worth noting just to begin. But we are here to the most notable event, of course, in the last 2 weeks has been this horrific shooting of Charlie Kirk. And even I didn't grasp the breadth of his reach within this country and overseas. But we're struck by the gathering, the reaction, and that memorial in Arizona. And the late Dan Robinson and I thought a while back that this country could be saved only by another great awakening. I thought, if this wasn't a moment, what would it be? The performance the remarkable performance of Erica Kirk at that moment, but all the fixings, everything going on, the inspiration of people to go back to church, and her presence commanding the attention of that audience, and that remarkable gesture of offering forgiveness, drawing on Jesus at the cross, offering forgiveness to the man who killed her husband. And I I don't recall now, Dave, but I thought I don't recall any of the members of the Kennedy families offering forgiveness for Lee Harvey Oswald or Sirhan. It was a remarkable performance. But Gerry, what is your sense of what was happening? Listen, do you think that has the features of a great awakening in prospect here?
Well, I certainly hope that it does have that effect. I fear it won't. I don't have a prediction about where political discourse will go in the wake of these events, the assassination and then the funeral, so to speak, or the celebration of life. I do agree completely, as I guess almost everybody is saying, that Erica Kirk, was a singular performance, an extraordinary speech, and a compelling figure. And I stepped back after reading some of the encomia for her talk, which are well deserved. And it did occur to me that, well, that's what a Christian does, what a Christian should do, what a person is called to do, to forgive 70 times 7. But then it occurred to me that you just don't see it very often, however many Christians, including Catholics, I mean by Christian, how many one knows. So it's an extraordinary thing to see actually happen. I think it's uncommon, perhaps rare, but it is the duty of every Christian. Now, I'm talking, as one private person or private citizen, if you will, to other private citizens. I'm not talking about the proper response of public authority to the assassination. That's a different matter. Jesus calls us Christians to turn the other cheek, but I don't think that's advice that we really think Jesus meant for, nor do we wish for our police officers and our military simply to turn the other cheek. But be that as it may, I've encountered a few other examples. I've personally encountered a few, not many examples of this extraordinary grace-filled faith and forgiveness that Erica Kirk exhibited. And the one that comes to mind in a different context, and Hadley, you mentioned this to me offline not long ago, that is earlier today, put us in mind of Pope John Paul II meeting with his would-be assassin, Muhammad. And I can still, at this very second, I can conjure in my mind's eye a picture, the one of that encounter,
Right.
of JP St. John Paul II sitting
In the jail.
simple armchairs in a jail area, if not a jail cell. And the two of them with these extraordinarily serious looks on their face. And if I remember the picture correctly, JP St. John Paul II, Pope John Paul, seems to be the one speaking, and I was sitting in rapt attention. Now that's another singular or nearly singular moment, but all blessings on Erica Kirk and her family.
That's the picture that remains in my mind. But isn't it curious that in the aftermath, the reaction was people to think call that into question. I think, that's an odd thing to do right now. And Trump got on and said, well, I'm not inclined to forgive. My own thing. Look, Trump seemed to react in the kind of Hebraic way, transcended by Jesus on the cross. No, I mean, something evil was done. It has to be paid back, and so people seem to forget where this inclination came to forgive, as you say, 70 times over, and why that was treated as something a bit odd at that moment. That the most natural reaction was to punish, not to forgive.
Right. No, I think it was treated as a curiosity. And as I say, it's not common on the ground, but it is the universal duty of Christians. I myself confess that I can't imagine myself having those spiritual resources were I in Erica Kirk's situation.
Right.
I don't know what Trump's spiritual resources are. It's way above my pay grade to make any attempt at evaluating that. But if we should think of the president speaking as a figure with public authority, and perhaps the prose could have been a little more refined, but nonetheless, I would insist, notwithstanding what I've said about Christian duty and my admiration for Erica Kirk, I don't think any of that should matter to a public prosecutor. I would not myself suggest for a moment that the sentiments or convictions, opinions, attitude of survivors of any homicide victim on a prosecutor. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's not only something that would be difficult for one to expect, but I think it's not right. And it's easy to see how that view, the view that the forgiveness offered by the survivors should somehow derail or supplant or affect even a prosecution, that can easily go off the rails if you think of someone, let's say a homeless person is murdered. There's no one to express any position. Or in a
Right.
homicide case where the relatives are hardly acting like Christians and are calling for blood. So you can't go down that road. And to the extent prosecution these days, and not just woke prosecution, but before the advent of woke prosecution at the time of George Floyd's murder, before then there was a very widespread movement that's still alive and well in criminal justice to have victim impact statements and to have family members speak at sentencing. I actually don't think that's a good idea either, but I am quite convicted myself in saying I have a very strong view and willing to argue it out on whatever occasion presents itself, that even so admirable a figure as Erica Kirk is not making decisions for the state of Utah, and she shouldn't be.
Sure. So it's understood, even if she forgave him, in fact, if they move toward capital punishment, and she might be inclined to argue against capital punishment, but I think even she understands that her giving forgiveness at this moment does not foreclose the proper response to the law in weighing the
Absolutely.
evidence, weighing the punishment. So she knows that. Right. Now, but on the matter of Kirk himself, we've been talking about this, and I'm surprised by the reach of this young man and what he's accomplished in his 31 years. But it struck me that he's being venerated for something like not the right reasons. He seems to be celebrated now as an example of the cause of free expression not constrained by any sense of its moral limits. Picking up that line from Alito, recalling Justice Brennan in Texas versus Johnson, that the First Amendment guards even speech that is offensive. So there's nothing so bad you can say if offensive that could not be legitimate. And Kirk himself picked up on that reading of it. He said, even hate speech is legitimate. But that I think is not what Kirk was really representing. He wasn't giving us an example of free expressions, venting opinions with no substance to them or no sense of limits. What he was offering us rather was argument. He was trying to draw people in to a conversation and an argument. C.S. Lewis, remember, recalling the way children argue. They're not merely over likes and dislikes. They're having a quarrel. And as Lewis used to say, a quarrel makes no sense unless people are assuming on both sides that this makes no sense, unless there are standards of judgment at work here, by which we can tell the difference between good and bad reasons. And that's what Kirk was doing. He was challenging people to show me where I'm wrong. And I was very taken with some of the videos we've seen of him, of a student calling him a fascist. And his response was to say, tell me, what is it that I've said, I've done, that fits the description of a fascist? He's putting the question back to this guy. What do you really know about fascism? And that's what stymied this guy and dumbfounded him. Or a gal telling him, the nascent life in the womb. She didn't use that expression. That fetus it's that embryo. It's an embryo. It's not a human being. You might as well say it's a 3-year-old, not a human being. And it was quite evident that these people have not had any serious conversation about abortion. How do you justify that? Why do you regard this nascent life in the womb as anything less than a human being? It strikes me that is what he was doing. He wasn't really engaging argument in the best sense.
Right.
We can exchange reasons. I'm bringing you in to treat you civilly, as in conversation, to consider the arguments, the exchange of reasons, and all this implies a test of truth. And that is, I think, what the others find so galling about this, that he was appealing to standards of truth in judging these things. So it's, I try to make the argument to our friends at the Wall Street Journal that they say, hate speech hate speech has been converted into a way of branding as hateful the speech that casts adverse moral judgments on us. So you find priests praying in front of an abortion clinic, as people say, wow, you're making a moral judgment. you don't realize how wounding that is. So anything we say that casts a moral judgment can be converted into being hate speech or hate expression. But I was trying to argue that there is a center of the problem, that the distinction, the hard distinction that has to come between the speech on substantive things, even heated speech with colored terms, but on substantive points, as opposed to the kind of speech that has been long recognized as wounding, hate, as inflicting harms, the sadistic call in the night, the threatening or the extortionate letter, or yes, people burning crosses outside the home of a black family. You didn't need a lawyer to tell the difference among these things. We used to say you don't need a lawyer to understand the difference between the legitimacy of reading and discussing Hitler's Mein Kampf, as opposed to a band of Nazis trying to parade through a community of Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois, trying to draw attention to themselves by reigniting the nightmares of these people. And of course, as Justice Murphy used to remind us in the old Chaplinsky case, context is always important. The ordinary man can tell the difference between the Nazis trying to harass Jewish survivors in Skokie and a bunch of Nazis on the stage in Mel Brooks' Producers doing Springtime for Hitler. If any man of wit could tell the difference with it, there's nothing inscrutable about these things. All people of ordinary judgment can do these things. So I think that's our test to try to retrieve it. And then we apply these things, of course, to the campuses now. We could read Mein Kampf, but we can recognize we couldn't allow people to feign the burning of crosses on the campus. I don't think that would survive a minute at Amherst College, feigning the burning of crosses, as opposed to say, calling for the free Palestine for the river to the sea, or band around among Jewish students saying, yes, it's going to be October 7th, 10,000 times over. So again, my pitch, Gerry, said it's strange that that even Kirk, as he tried to defend himself, would try to pick up the lines of recent conservative decisions about saying, no, there's nothing so offensive that can't be grounded as it's legitimate, as supposed to recognize what his true gift was and his true contribution.
Yeah. Well, you and I have been around college campuses, university campuses, quite a bit over the last 50 or more years.
Right.
And when I look at videos of Charlie Kirk, and I've only watched a few, but when he's countering an undergraduate or even a graduate student, and very often at a very fine university, as you're describing, Hadley, what seems to be gobsmacking his interlocutor, his student interlocutor, is not an objection on his part to whatever it is that person says, whether it's calling Charlie Kirk a fascist or anything else. But it's just a simple request, not a demand, but a simple request for reasons. And I think both you and I have been around enough to realize that that's a request that's not often made in college and university classrooms any longer. I'm sorry to observe myself, as I cross the country and speak on campuses and talk to people and give lectures, that it even sometimes happens in a classroom where I where I've taught at Notre Dame. But students now, you might say, come to the encounter having been patronized, I think is the right word, by their teachers, who certainly give them the impression, if not just say outright, it's fine, we just want to know what you're feeling. So that you have a situation where students may engage in what could be called, with some stretching of the meaning of the term, free expression, but they actually don't know anything about speech, genuine speech, which is what you're describing. So, it might well be that a robust system of free speech is essential to democracy, but the kind of free expression I'm talking about, where a student thinks that it's sufficient contribution to a seminar, for example, to simply announce his or her own stance, to make it clear what that person's conclusions are, or to reveal their identity or how they feel about the issue. That seems to be a sufficient warrant to intervene in a seminar discussion. In my own
Uh,
practice as a teacher, I would often in class, when I encountered that situation, would say basically the following, and I recommend it to other teachers who are listening to the podcast, without, I think, losing my cool or indicating any annoyance. I would say, well, you've explained to us very, effectively what it is you're feeling or where you stand on this issue. But if there's 60 students in this room, you have to assume that one or more of them don't at this moment agree with you. So I'm asking you if you could give in that one or more student a reason. Like, what is it you would say to someone who doesn't share your stance that you think might change their mind and make them come around to your stance? So that way we can all learn, and you might be able to tell us why we should hold the same position you do. It's a long-winded way of asking for reasons. And I have to say that as often as not, when I first do that in a class, it's greeted with a lot of blank looks. Like, what do you mean? Like, I just told you where I'm coming from on this and how strongly I feel about it. What are you even asking me? But before long, the requirement of the classroom that you have to give reasons. We're not really very much interested in where you're starting or where you stand. We're very interested in journeying together to a position that's based on reasons. And I think that's what Charlie Kirk did. I mean, really, day in, day out, he could do it colorfully. He could do it in verbal combat. He could do it in a calmer atmosphere. But he asked for reasons. And that's not a lost art, but a diminishing art form, even on campuses.
right, that used to arise because G.E. Moore used to say, if it were simply a matter of feeling, we could never have a moral argument
Right.
because you are the sovereign expert on what your own feelings are. That old line from
Correct.
I can't say I have a toothache unless I'm mistaken. You are the sovereign judge of whether you have that toothache. You are the sovereign judge. So I can't now dispute your feelings. So the question for now is, if you're saying the ground of your feeling establishes the rightness of abortion, that it's a rightness only for yourself. Are you
Right.
addressing are you really addressing the question before us of the rightness or wrongness of abortion, or whether the law may have any grounds for restricting it? So to the extent you're appealing to things, you're just out of the game. You're really irrelevant here. Do you remember the thing we used to use, Gerry? We've used this so much in the past. I used to draw from Lincoln's argument, that fragment he wrote for himself, imagining himself in a conversation with an owner of slaves, saying, "Why are you justified in treating the black man as less than human? Is it because somebody you fit to rule? Is it because you are more intelligent than he is? I'll beware the next white man that comes along more intelligent than you. Man, slave. It's because of color. The lighter skin having the right to rule the darker. Well, beware again. You may be rightly enslaved by the next white man who comes along with a complexion even lighter than yours." And it was, as Aquinas used to say, the divine law we know through revelation. The natural law we know through that reasoning that ordinary people can understand. Lincoln's argument here was accessible to people across the religious divisions. There's no principled ground on which you could rule out the black man as a human being. That would not apply to many whites as well. And we used exactly that same mode of reasoning. You and I have done that over years on abortion. Why is that nascent life in the womb less than human? Doesn't speak yet, neither do deaf mutes. Doesn't have arms or legs. People lose arms or legs in the course of their lives without losing their standing. Now, that's what I used to do at Amherst. And those simple lines set the framework of the discussion. And that had a notable effect. And I have a sense I just couldn't do that at Amherst anymore. And I guess no one else is doing it. And that just seems to be missing in what's going on the campus these days. I think you're quite right.
So, Gerry, the natural law moment that we've been living in, I think, comes as a response to the moral relativism that has pervaded the campuses. And speech is just one of the examples. And the hunger that comes from this current generation of students, as you were alluding to, seems to be from a place of trying to find a common starting point, which we like to assume is accessible to anybody with a good head on his or her shoulders. And I think part of Kirk's appeal to Gen Z and millennials on the campuses comes from a place where what he was saying was seen as provocative, and his free expression was the kind of act that was transgressive on the campuses. Maybe it was speaking in shibboleths that were not permitted. To say something like marriage is between a man and a woman, to say that we have a natural right to self-defense, and that would not only be protected by the Constitution, it would be effectuated by owning a firearm. Things like Kirk's appearances on the campus were made to be events, right, and rightfully so. But why is his memorializing being seen as an opportunity for some who believe that we now need to double down on a form of relativism in speech? In essence, Kirk himself said that the Nazis who marched through Skokie were being defended rightly by the ACLU. Why is it such that the transgressive nature of what Kirk was doing by appearing on these campuses, trying to actually bring us back to that position where we could make arguments, we could deliberate according to a publicly accessible set of reasons? But we weren't doing so in a power against power or an all against all. We were doing so in the form of deliberation about what is true. Why is that? I think what seems to be the enduring appeal of Kirk, and yet we can't say it in the terms of free speech is directed towards the pursuit of truth.
Two things to keep in mind. It's not only my judgment and probably the judgment of most people listening to the podcast, but I think there's a dawning awareness on the campuses among young people generally. I've lost track of which alphabet letter we're up to. I don't even know if today's college students are Gen Z or X or XY. I have no idea. But the cohort of persons, like let's say 18 to 30, maybe a little bit younger, some high school students, I think they're sensing, maybe they can't quite articulate it, and maybe if they could articulate it, they might be fearful of articulating it. But I think they sense that the whole identity project, where all there is to say about matters of importance is where you stand or what you feel. They have been looking and told to look for a kind of authenticity. It's a matter of your truth, that the real you is something idiosyncratic deep down in you. Don't be conscripted into playing out social scripts. What I'm calling the identity project. But I think people are coming to realize, even young people, they're realizing it's a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac. It's really the abyss. There's nothing there, nothing at all. And I think Charlie Kirk, and what we should take away most of all, besides admiring his courage and fearlessness and his Christian faith, he was an inveterate practitioner, an incorrigible practitioner of reasoned discourse. Now you'd say, well, that's great.
Right.
It sounds philosophical, and we're sort of philosophical at JWI. But there's something much more profound, at least I'm trying to say something much more profound. It actually is like coming into the cave with a lantern or a searchlight, because what Charlie Kirk is suggesting, he's indicating, what he's witnessing to, is the possibility of a way out of the abyss. That is to say, renewing or instilling in young people the sense, you know what? There's actually if you take seriously thinking and listening and giving reasons, there actually is a payoff. You may actually discover what's true, what's real. If you want authenticity, then try to figure out what's real as opposed to fantastic and delusional. But I think that we should think of his mode of interacting as really carrying a light into the darkness and opening up their prospects. So in another context, leave aside Charlie Kirk for a moment, but on campuses, if you said, look, let's talk about the truth about marriage. What's marriage really about? And you started talking, I guess the first student you encounter say, well, that's white man's marriage, or that's your marriage, or that's Catholic marriage. Everything has a possessive adjective or modifier. It's yours, not mine. So this whole way of organizing thought and of conversing, where everything is about the possessor of a proposition, and there aren't any real propositions. There are just expressions that are yours. It actually is wearying, unfulfilling, and I think, frankly, deadening. And Charlie Kirk, in whatever resistance he met, and I don't suggest he converted even a significant fraction of the people he encountered. Nobody could. But I think he
Right.
did something that is people are young people even caught on to what he was doing. We can learn, we can judge, and come to a way of seeing the world that is simply better, more authentic, because it's true. And there is a pathway to getting at truth. It's not always blocked by the other person's, you know, possession of the so-called truth.
It is curious that sometimes people see us people may see us more readily than what we don't see in ourselves.
Yeah.
And we've drawn lessons from Charlie Kirk. It was not exactly the ones he drew. He was something like free expression, but as Gerry said, he was offering the example of discourse. And as I pointed out, the argument doesn't make sense unless you assume their stances of truth. Now, when I used to walk into the classroom at Amherst, I assumed that everybody that the ethic of cultural relativism had pervaded everything. And you remind me that I used to recall this commentary I found in the library of my late father-in-law, Meyer Waxman, about something, I think it was Kings 2, where God tells Elijah, lodged at Mount Horeb, to go to Damascus and install Hazael as ruler there. And he says this story, which must be about 9th century BCE, is a sign of how early the Jews were committed to monotheism. Really? I thought we were always monotheists. But no. David Novak says, no, sometimes just henotheists. It's the God of Israel. And the question, well, what is there that marked monotheism? Well, the assumption was when the God who's telling Elijah to cross the border is not one of those local gods known to antiquity. This was a God of a universal jurisdiction. So look, those 10 commandments, were they municipal regulations about the immediate vicinity of Mount Sinai? Or were they supposed to be universal in their reach? So the question you used to put to people is, you come from Christian Jewish house families. Why does the doctrine of cultural relativism have such a strong hold on you rather than that Judaism or Christianity, which you've been nominally raised? So I see on the other side of this matter with Kirk, I say, look, I go back to the founding generation naturally understood that for every liberty we can mention, there's a converse form of license. They knew that every liberty could be directed to rightful or wrongful ends. They know that speech could be a vehicle for inflicting serious injuries, as well as any other brand of our version of our freedom. They knew that nothing categorically innocent about speech. John Marshall said anyone who publishes a libel in this country can be sued or indicted. He could be sued for personal damages, or indicted for stirring a riot, stirring hostility to religious minorities. So the problem here is that if we simply fall back on the notion that nothing can be so offensive that it cannot be legitimate speech, we're losing at once the recognition there is a moral ground to establish the goodness, the value of moral argument over right and wrong. And at the same time, by rejecting it, avoiding it, we're not recognizing the rightful moral boundaries to
So
free expression.
Hadley, is the best construction then of what Kirk offered us not on principle but instead in prudence, meaning we've driven into a ditch, but Kirk was showing us a way to get out of the ditch, even if we need to be driving on the bumpy breakdown lane to get back onto the highway, meaning we are unfortunately dealing with we're dealing with the corrosive influence of moral relativism and the lack of any kind of truth infusing our discourse, or at least in the mainstream. But what Kirk was offering us was at least the very prudent argument that we need to be able to make our argument in the first place, and then we'll basically persuade others that indeed there can be truth. I agree with you. I think on principle it's not a tenable argument, but could the argument be made that as a prudential move there's value in it?
Well, you take people where they are. You try to engage them where they are, But it could be what's John Finnis's old line about the man who's saying, "I'm not singing." It's he's disclaiming what he's performatively doing.
Yeah.
Now, so that Kirk was not saying, what I'm bringing you is a moral project with a moral ground and moral boundaries. I'm going to show you how we do argument. And perhaps bringing people into the doing of the thing, they realize that this is not making a sense unless you understand you're coming out here to refute me and to prove me wrong. And if you understand that, you've got the terms of this conversation. You've got the rules of the game. So,
I agree.
right.
I mean, you're referring to what I think Finnis and some other philosophers call, no one wants to hear me sing, believe me. So I won't try to do that, Hadley. But referring to that thing you did a minute ago, that's, I guess, called a performative self-contradiction.
Right.
But I do think, and I am agreeing with Hadley, and I think Garrett as well, that the question is something like, what's the biggest or most important legacy of Charlie Kirk's short life and short career? I think it's actually not that he was a courageous spokesman for the truth, whether it's the truth about God, the truth about marriage, the truth about the unborn, the truth about morality. Although, as far as I can tell, he was a very effective spokesperson for those truths. And God bless him for that. But I think actually in our circumstance, it would behoove us, it'd be better for all of us to cherish him above that, as someone who, to use the terms, the images we're kicking around, someone who shone a light in the darkness, tried to show, not so much convince people by arguing for the conclusion that it's worth arguing, but engaging them in argument and letting them draw the conclusion, well, that was actually, I've experienced something that perhaps people Hadley's age and my age, maybe Garrett, we, even in colleges that were liberal colleges, we would go to seminars in liberal colleges, whether it's Cornell or University of Chicago, you call it whatever you want, or name another school. We were required to give reasons and to respect reason giving as a practice. And I fear that that's being lost and already imperiled and being lost in our schools. So I think Charlie Kirk should be celebrated more than anything else, besides as a family man and as a believing and faithful Christian, as someone who did more than probably anybody else to revive the tradition of discourse among America's young people. I can't think of anybody else who's done more.
Thank you, Hadley. Thank you, Gerry. And to all of our listeners, we're grateful for you joining us for another episode of Natural Law Moment. Please remember to rate and subscribe to Natural Law Moment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you enjoy your podcasts. And until we see you again, thanks for listening.